So today we're going to do something a little bit different. Today we are going to focus on Git. Git is the tool we use. It's called a version control software, VCS, or version control, or just Git. But it is the tool we use in order to track our changes to files. So if you want to keep track of everything that's going on in a project, especially if you have a lot of users, we need some sort of version control, which is controlling the versions, right? So, hey, version 1 has, let's say, just hello world in my program, and version 2 has a bunch of variables. Version 3 changed the variable names, and a bunch of other stuff happened. The core of Git is just a program that is keeping track of changes to files. They don't have to be files that contain code. They can contain text. But it's just keeping track of files that deal with code. It's keeping track of the changes in files, as long as it's, some sort of text or some sort of bytes, which is all files are bytes, right? We are not going to cover Git by itself, but I want to make it very clear that Git is the tool we're using at the end of the day, and so you're going to need to have Git installed. There'll be a link in the description to install it. Additionally, we are using it inside of PyCharm, as we've been doing all of our other code. So I'm going to open PyCharm. And one more thing is we're going to put the results on GitHub. So those are three separate things, right? There's PyCharm, GitHub, and Git. PyCharm is the program we've been using. This is the program you've seen, the program we've been using to write all of our code up until this point. Git is the software that controls the stuff we're going to store, and then GitHub is the place where we're going to store our code, right? So github.com over here. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to set up the repository on GitHub. A repository or repo is just the collection of all the code. So we're going to set that up. Then I'm going to link it to our local. Then I'm going to create the repository locally. So it's two separate things. One is we create it on the remote, and then we create a local. And then we take the files and we say, oh, hey, Git, I need you to start tracking this stuff. And then we make a couple of changes because of Git. And then once all that's done, we save our changes. We save it, which is in something called a commit, and then we upload to GitHub. So in the abstract it's a little weird, but there's three things that we're using. There's the Git, which is the software that saves the stuff. The GitHub is the place that keeps track of all those saves that Git does. It's the remote server, same way if you have a file and you use Google Drive, or if you use Dropbox. GitHub is like Dropbox for Git repositories. And then PyCharm is just the tool we use to write our code, but PyCharm has version control built into it. It has a way to access Git very conveniently, so we're going to use that directly. So the first thing I do is I'm just going to create the repository remotely, and I'm going to call this, what's the local version called? Local version is called Python 101, so we're going to call this Python 101. You're going to have to create a GitHub account if you don't have one. They're totally free. There's a free option. If you're a student in school somewhere, I highly recommend the GitHub Education Pack. It comes with a lot of stuff, and those are really great. Like just access to other software, including educational licenses for like the professional version of PyCharm, and a bunch of other things. I'm going to give this a description. I'm actually not even going to give a description right now. We're going to make it public. I'm not adding any of the files. The reason why I'm not adding any files here is because I'm already I want to use my existing files here to start up my repository, and if I put files in this repository already, it would get very confusing about which version of what is supposed to go where, and it would lead to a lot of headaches. So I create my repository, and GitHub now has this repository, that URL, and this repository all set up, right? github.com/mentalz/python101. If you went there right now, you would actually see this with the files that we'll have in it by the end of this lesson. And as we keep going through more lessons, we're going to have more files in there. So we've spoken a little bit about what Git is. We've set up our repository on the remote server, which is basically we created a folder on our Google Drive, kind of. Not exactly. It's more like we created a Google Drive account. Google Drive has like one account where all your drives are. In this case, we have a bunch of different drives. Like each project is its own thing. So we created the repository on GitHub, and then we have to take our code and we have to turn it into a repository. We have to do an important thing, which is tell Git what to ignore, and then we have to upload all the stuff. So we have to save the stuff and upload the stuff. So first things first is in PyCharm, I go to VCS, which is version control, and I go create Git repository. This is going to take my code and it's going to turn it in to a Git repository, which means now Git is going to keep track of the files here. So I have to set the folder. So the folder is just going to be my project / Python 101. I click OK. And now you'll see a bunch of the names are red. The reason why the names are red is because those files aren't actually added yet to the repository. So basically, Git has to be told, hey, you have to keep track of changes. And then every time I make changes, I say, hey, Git, and then I have to save those. I have to save, hey, we're committing, we're making all these changes as one save point. In order to make that save point a thing, what we need to do is we need to say, hey, Git, we're saving here, and I want you to track all of the changes made to this list of files. So we have our file. We created the Git repository that looks like nothing here, but if you see no changes here, but if we open in Explorer, right? So we actually open the folder in Microsoft Explorer, and I look at View, Show Hidden Items. You see how there's a .git folder now. This is a Git folder, and there's a really good video. I'll set up a link somewhere that goes through just the basics of what's in this folder, and there's a bunch of details, but that's just, hey, this is a Git repository, which means now Git is going to track all the changes in this file. So now we got to say, hey, Git, I want to add all these things that changes. You'll notice that once we created the Git repository, this menu item actually changed to Git instead of version control. And there's this commit thing on the side over here, which is, hey, all these files I can add. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to add all these files, but we need to create one file first. We need to create a git ignore. A git ignore is a file that tells Git what to ignore. That's why it's called a git ignore. So we're going to, in order to make it, we're going to go to gitignore.io. And we're going to add all the kinds of files that we're likely to have that we want Git to ignore. So for example, we have a bunch of Windows system files, right? Because we're using Windows, so we have Windows system files. Someone might download this on Mac OS, and we want them to ignore that too. We're doing some Python stuff, so there might be some built-in Python files. We're using VENV, right? We're using virtual environment, VENV. We have that folder there that we want to ignore. And we are using PyCharm. Now the reason I'm going to do PyCharm plus all because I don't want any of the PyCharm files. Sometimes you might want some of them and there's differences in that, but for now these are all the ones we're going to do. We're going to create, we're going to go Control-A, Control-C, which is we copy all that stuff. And now I open a new file. I go .gitignore. Make sure that there's a period at the start. Make sure it's a new file, so it's specifically a .gitignore file. It's going to say, hey, do you want to add this? And this is going to start asking us for every time. For now, we're just going to say add. And we're going to save. And we're going to save. And so I copied all that stuff. I pasted it here, and you'll see it's just a bunch of different file types and things like that. And it's just a list for Git to know, hey, don't add any of this stuff to gitignore. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add don't track any of these changes that we've made. That's what doing that will tell Git. So now the list of files over here, you'll notice might have gotten a little bit smaller because of the gitignore file, Git is not going to track specific files. We want it to track all of our Python files. Now an important thing to know here is it never tracks folders, it just tracks files and the path that they exist on. So if I have like 4 folders, in order for me to actually track that, I need to put a file at the end of it. So now I've got all these folders in here. We need to have, so now we're going to save them. We're going to commit them. This is actually setting our save point for Git. So in this case, I got to, I'm going to call this the initial commit, and I'm going to commit. And now all of these files, and now there's a save point in my project up to lesson 6. Everything's been saved, but that's only on my computer. Now I don't just want it on my computer, I also want it on the server, right? So I need to push, which is to send stuff up to the server. So I'm going to click the push button. And we don't Git, our local Git doesn't have a definition of where our server is yet. We have to define what the server. We have to say, hey, this is the server. So we say define remote. It asks for a URL, right? So we go back over here and we copy this URL specifically, which is the one that GitHub set up for us. And we click OK. And it has a place where it's sending it to. It's sending to master. And we're just going to go push, which is, hey, send all these files up to the server. Send all the changes I've made up, which in this case is I've created a bunch of files and put some stuff in them. That's the only change that Git tracked so far. So we click push. And that stuff goes up to the folder. Now, if we look over here and we refresh, you will see all my files are now here. And there's a README file, and GitHub automatically reads that README file and puts that out. So if you want to know what my upcoming lesson plans are, and if you want to know what the lessons that already covered were, you'll see that listed here. Now, the one important thing is that if you did this, if you're following along step by step, you might have gotten, hey, Git needs to log in. When that happens, I recommend you click the token option. So either you do the login via GitHub if you're using your personal computer. Login via GitHub is fine. The alternate is you do the token option. It will say, hey, we're going to create a token. A token is just a temporary thing that you can destroy at any time. This way your password's not saved locally. And you can reject and regenerate that token if you forget it, and you just have to copy it and paste it back into PyCharm, and it'll link everything up. PyCharm by default says, hey, we need a token that lets us do this, this, and this. So it'll work perfectly as it is if you just scroll to the bottom of that page and click create token. That is how we set up Git. From now on, whenever I make changes, right? So if we if I create a new lesson, or if I make some edit to a file, let's say I make an edit to a file over here, I delete this print nums thing, or I delete this print nums one, and I save. First of all, notice how PyCharm changes the color to blue. That's just PyCharm's little thing of telling you, hey, there's edited files, there's edits in here that haven't been saved. And if you look closer, you'll see that this might be a little bit hard for you to pick up, but there's a little blue thing over here. And if I delete a line, notice how there's like a little arrow over here, like, hey, something's been deleted. And it's actually keeping track of all the changes relative to my last save point. So I just undid those two and I saved, and it turns back to white because nothing new has changed. That is just like one of the many small features that exists because we're using version control, which is keeping track of all the changes made between the last save point and the next save point, which the tool that actually keeps those changes is Git. Because we're using Git in this project, PyCharm is a really smart program, shows us a lot of cool things based on that. So yeah, that is Git in a nutshell, at least how we're going to be using it. There's a lot more stuff to it, and I highly recommend looking into more details, because especially with GitHub, there's like a ton of crazy stuff you can do. For example, you can have it run tests every time you upload your code, and you can protect it. You can protect it from branches and things like that, and we might talk about Git in a little more detail, but this is like the Git 101 and just how to set it up in a project in PyCharm. As always, if you have any questions, let me know and I'll be happy to answer them.